If you've seen Tony Mandarich on the cover of Sports Illustrated or watch him play football at Michigan State, you know he's been dubbed the best tackle to hit the NFL in decades.
Some people think I'm arrogant. Some people think I'm cocky. Some people think I'm too confident. Well, that's their problem, not mine, because they wish that they were where I am.
Where Tony is on top. He's the best offensive lineman to come out of college football in years. He went second in the 1989 NFL Draft. At 6'6", 315 pounds, Tony has captured both respect and suspicion. Suspicion that steroids helped make him what he is.
You're not supposed to be 6'6", 315 pounds, benching, 560, squatting 7, running a 4.6, doing all these things that make NFL scouts drool without taking steroids. Well, I've tested negative every time I've tested.
Whenever the question was asked, do you do steroids by the media? My answer would always be like, I've never tested positive for steroids.
Right.
So it's like, you got to be pretty dumb not to read between the lines. Exactly.
Yeah, there's only 2 lines.
Right.
Yeah.
Good planning and hard work lead to prosperity, but hasty shortcuts lead to poverty. Proverbs chapter 21 verse 5. The year is 1989, and if you got a top 5 pick in this year's NFL draft, you've got some of the greatest odds in draft history to select the future Hall of Fame player. 4 out of 5 teams drafted in the top 5 walked away with franchise cornerstone pieces. Meanwhile, 1 team walked away with one of the biggest disappointments in the history of the league. Now, I wanted to open up talking about the 89 draft because it's obviously very important to the story. But I want to do something a little bit different and re-anchor the story with a different draft entirely. A draft that took place in 1984, 5 years before Tony Mandarich was picked. In 1984, Tony's big brother John was selected in the first round of the CFL draft. Tony had followed his big brother's blueprint. It had been like that since the day they was born. Whatever John did, Tony would follow. Big Bro was the only reason Tony picked up a football, but he was also the reason Tony picked up a syringe. But years later, with John's dying words, he renounced his decision to get his brother caught up with steroid use. His final request from the physician overseeing his treatment was for him to warn the football world about the dangers of steroids. But unfortunately, by that time, the damage had already been done. Steroids ruined one brother's career, and the other brother believed that they shortened his life. A goal without a plan ain't nothing but a wish. The Mandarich brothers grew up in Oakville, Canada, and big brother John had the experience and know-how. So little brother Tony followed every command his big brother gave, and he would till the command stopped coming. John Mandarich wasn't perfect, but he always wanted what was best for him and his brother. The choices he made were with both of them in mind. They both had dreams of NFL glory, and John would get the first crack at making that a reality. In the early 80s, John received a scholarship to play football at Kent State in Ohio. Meanwhile, little brother Tony, who was still in Canada, wasn't attracting the same attention as a player. But Big Bro was determined to get his little brother on track to play in the NFL. So they put their heads together and formulated a plan. It would take hard work, dedication, and a leap of faith. The brothers convinced their parents to let Tony move all the way from Canada to Kent, Ohio, to live with his brother. John, by this time, was about to be a senior in college, while Tony was about to be a senior in high school. Tony had never smoked or drank, and he never even considered taking steroids. But the small town of Kent, Ohio, would ultimately be his introduction to all of those things. Like any other kids their age, the Mandarich brothers participated in their share of partying, but at that time, they never lost sight of the ultimate goal: to play in the league. They wrote the plan out on paper. They both would play in the NFL, and they worked out daily, along with one of John's friends who was a local bodybuilder. Even though John didn't always get everything right, through the years he taught Tony many valuable lessons. One day at the gym, Tony didn't feel like working out, but he still had to go to the gym because John was his ride home. Now, John felt his little brother, who had been getting some attention from colleges was getting complacent. So just thinking about Tony taking a day off from lifting, that sent big bro John into a rage. He was so mad he decided, I'm gonna teach this dude a lesson. So he made Tony walk all the way home from the gym. It was a 3-mile walk in a damn snowstorm. John wanted to make sure Tony kept his eye on the prize. Tony got the message. He never looked back after that. The brothers weren't drawn to the stories of perfect footwork, precise hand placement, consistent leverage. They was drawn to the stories of guts and glory, something that could be achieved through physical strength and sheer toughness. The brothers still had a lot to learn about football, and they had even more to learn about life. Before steroids entered the picture, Tony was seen as a raw old lineman who needed some work but also had some innate ability. He was full of potential. This was enough to earn dude a scholarship offer from coach Nick Saban, yes, the legend himself, who was an assistant at Michigan State at that time. Tony had potential to become a solid pro, but he needed to focus on technique as much as he focused on strength. Had he decided to go that way, bro, this story could have been way different. Tony has slowly been introduced to a few new substances. Amongst kids that age, alcohol and marijuana were not uncommon, but he had a safety net because John wouldn't let him take things too far. He did his best to keep Tony in line, but let's be real, at this point, bro, John's just a kid himself. John had been striving to hold up his end of the deal, but at a certain point it started to become pretty clear that the NFL might not be the best route for him. In one league, John would be fighting for a roster spot, but the other league valued him way higher. In 1984, John Mandarich was selected first round of the CFL draft. It wasn't the NFL glory he'd always dreamed about, but as a Canadian himself, it was plenty good enough. John had always been a pretty solid player, but people started to notice something had changed. He was bigger, faster, and nastier than before. Check out this picture of him tracking down the CFL quarterback. The reason for the change was obvious to most, as John got the telling nickname, The Juice. Not because his initials were the same as orange juice, but because, well, you get it. Now, Tony didn't explicitly say, but it's reasonable to assume that the bodybuilder that the brothers worked out with out there in Kent was probably the source of their steroids early on. It would explain how they knew, prior to the internet age, the best practices for taking steroids and how to get the most out of them without getting caught. And Tony has spoken about how they knew what they were doing. Where they get that advanced knowledge? Most likely that bodybuilder friend. The improvement in John's play was so profound that like everything else, he wanted to share this gift with his brother. So he introduced Tony to anabolic steroids a few months before his college football career started. I want to stop one more time to just point out that this is telling of their natural ability. John went through most, if not all, of his college career without the steroids. According to the timelines in the story, between articles and podcast interviews, Tony earned his scholarship before he ever touched the steroid. But at a certain point, he made a decision to take a shortcut to try to fast track his success. But ultimately, bro, the shortcut really just put him on the fast track to failure.
I think he's made me realize that you can push your body a lot farther than I ever thought I could push it. And that's made me a better athlete.
The two brothers began to see steroids as the gateway to the NFL. They convinced themselves that this was the only way to get in. Reading between the lines a little bit, it seems that at the time, John might have regretted not actually using the steroids earlier. Maybe in his mind, he felt that if he had, he could have made it to the NFL instead of the CFL. So in big bro fashion, while this time it was misguided, he wanted to put Tony on while he still had time to boost his career and make it to the NFL, which was their original goal. It was the first deviation in the brothers' grand plan, the first dishonest part, and in the end, that was the thing that made everything fall apart. That's the thing that did it. If you want access to these scripts written out so you can go back and reference certain points, make sure you're subscribed to my newsletter. I post all the scripts to these videos days before they drop in video form, so you can always see what's dropping next and get early access to them. So click the link in the descriptions or the one pinned in the comments and subscribe to my newsletter, A Playbook for Life. That's the sponsor for today. back to the video. In college, Tony became so dominant that he forgot all about his bad technique. Thanks to his steroid use, he could now easily overpower his opponents and didn't need technique to win reps. It seemed great at the time, but his game stopped developing right then and there. His progression was over. Between 1987 and 1988, Tony won back-to-back Big Ten Lineman of the Year awards. He won UPI Lineman of the Year and even finished 6th in the Heisman voting. As an offensive lineman, he got 3 first-place votes, finishing above future Hall of Famers like Deion Sanders and Derrick Thomas, players he'd also be drafted higher than. But why didn't his dominance continue in the league? We're still in the college portion, but this next part will answer that question. Tony is on record talking about how mediocre the NCAA steroid testing was at the time. He admitted to not only taking steroids, but quote unquote taking them well. Taking pills and injections, understanding how to cycle, and going all out in his training to maximize results. He was fully dedicated to the steroid life, and he understood them way better than the people trying to catch him via steroid testing. When he was asked about it, Tony would say things like, well, I've never tested positive for steroids.
Well, I've tested negative every time I've tested.
When he got to that part in the Theo Von podcast, he said you would have had to been stupid to not read between the lines. His system for using was so locked in that college football was an absolute breeze. If NIL existed, dude would have got paid. He still eventually got paid, but it would have been crazier. It was around this time when Tony started believing his own hype, getting lost in the smoke and the mirrors. Bro, he practiced the magic trick, then he performed it, and somehow fell for his own damn trick. He was wilding so much that he called out a prime Mike Tyson to a boxing match.
If I didn't think I could beat Mike Tyson, if I didn't think I could rip his head off, I wouldn't go in there.
I know he had been partying a whole lot at this point, so I'm guessing he wanted to catch up on his sleep. Tony started rocking that old school bodybuilder swag and started branding himself as larger than life. Now, a big part of this was calculated. As fun fact, Tony Mandarich was a marketing major, so that little line I had about setting up the magic trick and practicing and everything and then falling for the trick goes even deeper, because as a marketing major, kind of knew what he was doing, but fell for his own commercial. Now, what he hadn't calculated were the long-term effects of his heavy steroid use, or what he would do if he had to stop taking them. I guess he dealt with that problem once it came up. Now it was time to wreck the NFL Combine. Tony measured in at 6'6", 330 pounds. And this the craziest part. 6'6", 330 with only 11% body fat. Dude looked more impressive than any lineman in league history with a muscle shirt on. Then he destroyed the combine like it's never been destroyed. He bench pressed 225 for 39 reps. That's gotta put him in like the top 20 all time. But he wasn't just strong. At 6'6", 330, this offensive lineman ran a 4.65. Do you understand how fast that is for a dude that's 6'6", 330? His hype was already out of control, but after the combine, it grew to legendary levels. He was called the greatest offensive line prospect ever due to his college success and his crazy measurables. The marketing genius sold himself so well that he was drafted amongst all Hall of Famers. But bro, imagine having an 80% chance to draft a Hall of Fame player. 4 out of 5 guys will be all-time greats. And bro, you reach your hand in and pick the one bust out of the whole pile of Hall of Fame talent. That's gotta be tough. I ain't gonna lie. While the Cowboys got future Hall of Famer Troy Aikman, the Lions got future Hall of Famer Barry Sanders, the Chiefs got future Hall of Famer Derrick Thomas, and the Falcons got future Hall of Famer primetime Deion Sanders, Neon Deion. You know, as I'm recording this, I just realized when I wrote this script, I kind of made a little mistake. So I'm gonna point it out because it's kind of annoying me. Depending on how you look at it, right? Me saying that they had an 80% chance is correct if I'm saying they had an 80% chance going into the draft. But by the time they picked second overall, they actually had a 75% chance since they never had the opportunity to draft Troy Aikman. So again, I guess it just depends on how you're looking at it. But by the time they picked, there was only 3 Hall of Famers left along with one bust. So that's a 3 in 4 chance, or 75%. So is it 80 or 75? It depends on when you did the measurement. But the Packers missed with the second pick, and they didn't just pick a guy who would turn out to be solid but just not live up to the draft billing. Nah, they picked a guy who would never be able to fully function in the NFL, a certified bust of legendary proportions. Big Bro's dying plea. Since drug testing was more sophisticated in the NFL, Tony decided to leave his steroid routine behind. He figured he'd probably just lose about 10% of his strength, but the reality was way more significant than that. When he removed the steroids, his body had to go through withdrawals, and he just ended up replacing them with a different drug. It was a drug that the league might not have tested for, but could eventually be detected with the naked eye alone. Painkillers and alcohol. The same concoction we talked about in last week's video with Ryan Leaf. Another all-time bust, oddly enough, struggled with the exact same affliction. Over the course of 2 seasons, Tony lost 40 pounds of muscle. He lost his energy, his edge, and even his hair. All symptoms of steroid withdrawal, by the way. In those same 2 years, Tony gave up 21 sacks and 36 QB knockdowns. And when he had to go against Hall of Famers like Reggie White, he got completely disrespected and dismantled. I actually want to look into the story of Reggie White, man, because like what I remember from my childhood is actually really dope. Let me just make a note real quick, because I need to see, like, I might do a video on Reggie White. I need to lock back in on Reggie White, man. Nobody talk about Reggie. He was a dog. Over in Canada, Tony's big brother John wasn't dealing with the same issues with testing. Even with a nickname like the Juice, he was still parlaying, using as much steroids as he wanted, and supplying teammates. For a while, Tony thought that John was the lucky one, until one day their perspective shifted. Around 1991, John was diagnosed with cancer. Tony's hero was struggling and fighting for his life. Tony was so far gone on pills and alcohol, he says he didn't process any of it until years later. But John was grateful that his little bro had given up steroids, even if it meant he wouldn't have the career they'd hoped for. John seemed to believe that his steroid use was directly connected to his cancer, which may or may not have been the case. But based on his dying request and the reports that came out, it seems that he really believed that the two things were linked. Now, steroid use has been linked to certain forms of cancer, but John's original diagnosis was melanoma, which is a skin cancer. Steroid use is more connected to things like liver cancer, which John's cancer did eventually spread to his liver, but that was not the origin point. John passed away at the age of 31, a gridiron warrior. May he rest in peace. He played 8 years in the CFL, and in his best year, he recorded 6 sacks. And for some reason, my dude had 2 kick returns. Maybe he was on Hans' team, or maybe he was the big dude that was back there to block and got his hands on a couple returns. I mean, yeah, he ain't really do a whole lot with them, but as a career lineman, to get your hands on 2 of these, honestly, we just gonna count that as a win. As a D tackle for most of his career, he was a brash type of player just like his brother. Again, everything John did, Tony emulated. And while Tony got more famous, he got much of his swag from his big brother. In an interview he did shortly before he passed, John spoke about sometimes just sitting watching TV. He'd be in a good mood, and then he'd remember the battle he was fighting, and he'd start to spiral. He passed away in his home, and at least from this article in the Tampa Bay Times, it says the 2 people at his side were his wife and a former teammate named Glenn Coca. It seems like Tony wasn't able to make the trip. I wondered if this was due to his football schedule, but by the time his big brother passed, so had Tony's football career. But as we recall, Tony did say it took him years to process because he was still messed up with addiction during this time. Tony was losing everything in his life, and now he'd lost his hero as well. The brothers came a long way from just a couple kids with a dream. They worked honestly for years and then decided to take the ultimate shortcut when it comes to athletics. The shortcut put them on a fast track to success, but also accelerated their fall to the bottom. Now John was gone and Tony was alone. He always followed his brother. What would he do now? Tony fell deeper into a haze of drugs and depression. He was a joke, a broken down fun house full of weed smoking mirrors. Then a few months after his big brother's passing, he suffered what was believed to be a mild concussion in a preseason game in 1992. Although it was believed to be a mild concussion, Tony would never suit up for the Packers again. Who can say whether or not it was really the concussion, or if he used it as a way to get away from the public? See, he told a doctor the concussion had given him the shakes, but he'd gone through bouts with that affliction since he put down the steroids. The shakes were the reason that alcohol came into play. From his first year in the league, he would need a drink to calm the shakes just so that he can function. So he'd been struggling with that for a really long time. If he really did just use the mild concussion as an excuse to get some time away from the public, I think that was an extremely wise decision because he needed time to mourn and he needed time to heal. But when Tony checked out of that preseason game, he didn't walk on an NFL field for the next 5 years. Application. I open with this quote: "Good planning and hard work lead to prosperity, but hasty shortcuts lead to poverty." Tony Mandarich started out on the right track with a solid plan and the willingness to work to achieve it, but he eventually lost patience in the process and introduced steroids as a shortcut. While it didn't lead to poverty from a financial standpoint, he was both morally and spiritually bankrupt. The dream that he did all of this to achieve became a nightmare that Tony never woke up from. It was so bad that when he lost his big brother and hero, he was too far gone to even mourn him properly. So when I started on YouTube, I was broke with a kid on the way. And my homeboy, my brother, bro, till this day, was trying to look out and he bought me a lottery ticket. But when he handed it to me thinking I would be happy, my immediate reaction was actually anger. I was so mad that he quote unquote tried to rob me of the process. I wanted to earn everything on my own. I was looking forward to the process of building from nothing. Now today my son's 9, and look, I won't lie, it'll be a lot harder for me to turn down that ticket at this point. But I gotta tell you, looking back on it, I think the young me got it right with that one. The shortcut can be alluring, but it's the longer path that's lined with lessons that shape your character. They turn you to the type of person who will fully appreciate and maximize your gifts when you finally reach a goal. The guy who takes the shortcut to reach his goal has still never actually reached it. If you set out to run a marathon and then pull a Jeffrey, you still ain't never really ran a marathon. And while the longer road might seem harder and uncertain, who's to say you can't accomplish your goal and keep your morals intact? 5 years after Tony Mandarich flamed out the league and got lost in his addiction, dude made a comeback. At 31 years old, he returned to the NFL. And guess what? He played for 3 more seasons. During that run, he started 32 out of 48 games, the equivalent of 2 full seasons as a starter. Even at an older age, he was still good enough to play in the league and be a starter. No juice, no hype, just Tony Mandarich. Meaning dude had it in him the whole damn time. Bro, the thing you're searching for is already within you. So quiet the noise around you and listen to that voice.